In today's video, I'm going to share an absolutely wild story about how my local HOA president completely lost her mind and actually called 911 when I blocked off my private driveway that she'd been illegally using as a cut-through to their gated community. This whole situation started as a simple property dispute, but escalated into something I never could have imagined, including false accusations, harassment, and even attempts to sabotage my property. Let's dive right into this crazy story, because trust me, you won't believe how it ends. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. It all started after I purchased my dream home in Oakridge Valley, a quiet suburban area just outside of Pine Grove. My property sits at an interesting spot, right between the main road and the prestigious Whispering Pines HOA community. What made my property unique was this long, paved private driveway that extended from the main road past my house and happened to end near one of the HOA's side entrances. Now, I should mention that I'm a pretty reasonable person. I work in real estate law, so I actually understand property disputes better than most. When I first moved in, I noticed occasional cars using my driveway as a shortcut to get into Whispering Pines, cutting about 5 minutes off their commute instead of using the main entrance. Initially, I didn't make a huge fuss about it. I figured maybe the previous owner had some informal arrangement with the neighbors. But here's where things started getting concerning. What began as occasional traffic turned into a steady stream of cars, especially during rush hour. We're talking about 30-40 vehicles daily, speeding down my private driveway like it was their personal expressway. The final straw came when I discovered that the HOA had actually listed my driveway as an alternate access route in their community newsletter, without ever consulting me or even attempting to reach out. This is where we meet Victoria Blackwood, or as the community secretly called her, the Iron Lady of Whispering Pines HOA. Picture this perfectly coiffed woman in her mid-50s, always wearing designer suits, who ruled the HOA with an iron fist and apparently thought her authority extended well beyond her jurisdiction. When I tried to schedule a meeting to discuss the situation, she sent back a curt email stating that the route had historical precedence and that my attempts to restrict community access would not be tolerated. I'll be honest. Her response left me stunned. I had approached the situation professionally, armed with property documents and a reasonable request to discuss the liability issues of having unrestricted traffic on my private property. Instead of a rational discussion, I was basically being told that my property rights didn't matter because of their convenience. What happened next would kick off a chain of events that would not only involve law enforcement, but would ultimately expose years of HOA mismanagement and lead to one of the most satisfying acts of revenge I've ever witnessed. But before I get into all the crazy details of how this situation exploded into a neighborhood-wide scandal, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe to my channel for more incredible true stories about dealing with entitled neighbors and HOA nightmares. Trust me, you'll want to stick around to hear how Victoria's attempt to assert dominance over my property backfired spectacularly, especially when she discovered that I had an ace up my sleeve that she never saw coming. The security camera footage of her meltdown alone is worth staying tuned for. When I first laid eyes on the Cedar Brook property back in March, it seemed like the perfect place to settle down. The sprawling 3-acre lot sat at the edge of Whispering Pines Estates, and the price was surprisingly reasonable for such a prime location. The real estate agent, Mrs. Thompson, had been unusually eager to close the deal, even throwing in additional closing cost coverage. Looking back, I should have recognized these as red flags, but I was too enamored with the property's potential. The house itself was a charming colonial-style home with a wraparound porch, but what really caught my attention was the long, paved driveway that meandered through a grove of mature oak trees. This private road, as I would later discover, stretched for about a quarter-mile from Maple Valley Road to the edge of my property. The previous owner had maintained it meticulously, and it was wide enough for 2 cars to pass comfortably. During the first week after moving in, everything seemed perfectly normal. I spent my days unpacking boxes, arranging furniture, and getting to know the layout of my new home. My nearest neighbor, an elderly gentleman named Mr. Chen, lived about 500 feet away on the opposite side of my property. He was the first to subtly warn me about what was coming. "You might want to invest in some good security cameras," he mentioned casually over the fence one evening. When I asked why, he just shrugged and said, "The dynamics around here can get interesting." At the time, I thought he was being overly dramatic. I couldn't have been more wrong. It was during my second week that I started noticing the pattern. Every morning between 7 and 9 a.m., there would be a steady stream of vehicles using my private road. At first, I assumed they were lost or following incorrect GPS directions, but as I observed more closely, I realized these were the same. Cars, day after day, clearly using my driveway as some sort of shortcut. I decided to do some research into the property's history. The previous owner, Dr. Marcus Sullivan, had lived there for over 2 decades before retiring to Florida. According to county records, the private road had been part of the original property since the 1950s, long before Whispering Pines Estates was even developed. There was no easement, no shared access agreement, nothing that would legally allow public use of my private road. What made the situation more complex was the layout of Whispering Pines Estates itself. The main entrance to the community was off Island Boulevard, about a mile north of my property. By cutting through my private road, residents could save about 10 minutes on their commute to the city. Over time, it seemed they had simply gotten used to this convenient shortcut, regardless of its legal status. I decided to take a methodical approach to understanding the situation. I set up a simple camera near my mailbox and began counting vehicles. Over the course of 1 week, I documented an average of 47 cars per day using my private road. Most were clearly Whispering Pines residents. Their vehicles displayed the distinctive blue parking stickers required by the HOA. The real eye-opener came when I discovered a recently archived copy of the Whispering Pines community newsletter from 3 months ago. There, in black and white, was a section titled Alternative Access Routes that actually listed my private road as an established community passage. They had even given it a name, Oak Grove Cut-Through. The audacity was stunning. They had essentially appropriated my private property without any consultation or permission. What troubled me most wasn't just the unauthorized use of my property. It was the potential liability issues. If someone had an accident on my private road, I could be held responsible. My insurance agent confirmed this when I called to discuss the situation, strongly advising me to either block access or obtain written agreements and additional coverage. Little did I know that my attempt to address these legitimate concerns would soon spiral into a neighborhood drama of epic proportions. Victoria Blackwood, as I would soon discover, had built her entire reputation on maintaining Whispering Pines' exclusive amenities, and apparently my private road had become one of them. The stage was set for a confrontation that would reshape the entire community's power dynamics. The more I learned about the situation, the more I realized this wasn't just about a convenient shortcut. It was about entitlement, power, and the assumption that rules didn't apply to certain people. As I would soon find out, Victoria's response to my perfectly reasonable concerns would demonstrate just how far some people will go to maintain their perceived privileges. The real gravity of my situation became crystal clear one rainy Tuesday morning in April. I was working from home that day, and the constant sound of vehicles splashing through puddles on my private road was making it impossible to focus on my conference calls. Looking out my home office window, I noticed something disturbing. Several large SUVs were actually creating deep ruts in my well-maintained grass shoulders as they passed each other on the narrow sections of the road. I decided to spend my lunch break documenting the damage. Armed with my phone camera, I walked the length of my private road, photographing the deteriorating conditions. The shoulders were torn up in multiple places, with mud and grass strewn across the pavement. Near the entrance, someone had even knocked over my newly installed mailbox, leaving it tilted at a precarious angle, with tire tracks clearly visible in the mud around it. But what really set alarm bells ringing was what I discovered near the back portion of the road. A group of landscaping trucks, clearly contracted by Whispering Pines Estates, had parked partially on my property while working on the HOA's decorative entrance garden. They had not only trespassed, but had also dumped several piles of lawn clippings and tree trimmings on my land. When I approached one of the workers to ask about this, his response was telling, "Mrs. Blackwood told us this was community property and we could use it for temporary storage." That evening, I decided to monitor the traffic more systematically. Setting up my lawn chair near the entrance of my private road, I began taking notes. Between 4:30 p.m. and 6:30 p.m., I counted 78 vehicles, more than one per minute. Many were speeding well above what would be safe for a private residential driveway, and several drivers even had the audacity to wave at me as if I was some kind of friendly gate attendant. The situation took an even more concerning turn when I witnessed a near accident. A red Tesla, trying to avoid an oncoming delivery truck, swerved sharply and barely missed hitting a jogger who was using my road as part of their evening exercise route. The jogger, wearing Whispering Pines Fitness Club attire, seemed more annoyed at having to jump aside than concerned about trespassing on private property. My insurance agent's warning kept echoing in my mind. If anyone got hurt on my property, I could be held liable. The thought of a potential lawsuit was keeping me up at night. I decided to document everything meticulously, creating a spreadsheet with dates, times, and vehicle descriptions. I even started taking photographs of license plates, focusing particularly on vehicles that seemed to be regular offenders. One morning, I intercepted a young woman in a white BMW who was a frequent user of my road. When I politely explained that this was private property and not a public thoroughfare, her response left me speechless. "Oh, don't worry. Victoria told us at the last HOA meeting that she's working on getting this road officially designated as a community access point. She said the previous owner never minded, so it shouldn't be an issue." This was the moment I realized I wasn't just dealing with casual trespassing. There was an organized effort to essentially annex my private road. The HOA, under Victoria's leadership, was actively encouraging residents to establish a pattern of use, possibly hoping to claim some sort of prescriptive easement over my property. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. I decided to seek legal counsel, scheduling a consultation with a property rights attorney. The lawyer reviewed my documentation and confirmed my fears. If I didn't take immediate action to assert my property rights, the continued use of my private road could potentially lead to legal complications down the line. She advised me to send a formal cease and desist letter to the HOA and to consider installing physical barriers to prevent unauthorized access. That weekend, I invested in a high-quality security camera system, installing cameras at both ends of the private road and several points in between. I also ordered private property, no trespassing signs, making sure to get ones that cited the relevant state statutes. What I captured on those cameras in just the first 48 hours was eye-opening. Not only the volume of traffic, but also instances of littering, unauthorized parking, and even someone stopping to let their dog relieve itself on my property. The final straw came when I reviewed the footage from early Sunday morning. A large, moving truck, clearly trying to access Whispering Pines through my private road, had miscalculated a turn and knocked down several of my newly planted ornamental trees. The driver didn't even stop to report the damage. When I calculated the total cost of property damage, unauthorized use and potential liability exposure, I knew I had to take decisive action. Little did I know that my next steps would trigger a neighborhood crisis that would expose years of HOA overreach and lead to some very unexpected consequences. Determined to handle this situation professionally, I drafted a carefully worded email to the Whispering Pines HOA board. I attached photographs of the damage, documentation of the traffic patterns, and citations of relevant property laws. My tone was courteous but firm, requesting a meeting to discuss the unauthorized use of my private road and to work out a mutually beneficial solution. The response I received 3 days later was both surprising and concerning. Rather than coming directly from Victoria Blackwood, the email was from the HOA's legal representative, James Whitmore. His message was a masterclass in corporate doublespeak, acknowledging receipt of my concerns while subtly implying that any attempt to restrict access could be met with legal challenges. "Dear property owner," the email began, not even bothering to use my name. "We acknowledge your correspondence regarding the Oak Grove access route. This thoroughfare has served as a vital community access point for over 2 decades, and any unilateral attempts to restrict established community usage patterns could result in significant legal complications. We suggest maintaining the status quo while our legal team reviews historical precedents." Undeterred, I decided to take a more direct approach. I printed out flyers explaining that the road was private property and would soon be restricted to authorized use only. I personally handed these to drivers when they stopped at my makeshift checkpoint one morning. The responses I received ranged from apologetic to openly hostile. One resident driving a luxury SUV actually rolled her eyes and said, "Oh, you must be new here. Don't worry about all this legal stuff. Victoria always takes care of these little problems." Another resident, a middle-aged man in a business suit, was more direct. "Do you have any idea how much our property values depend on convenient access? You can't just change things because you feel like it." I even tried reaching out to some of the more reasonable-seeming residents. Sarah Martinez, who I'd noticed was a daily user of my road, at least took the time to listen to my concerns. "I understand where you're coming from," she admitted, "but you have to understand, Victoria has been running things here for 8 years, and she's very protective of what she considers community privileges. Maybe we could work out some kind of formal agreement?" Taking Sarah's suggestion to heart, I drafted a detailed proposal. I offered to consider allowing restricted access during specific hours, provided the HOA would accept full liability for any accidents or incidents, pay for road maintenance and repairs, install speed bumps and proper signage, compensate me for the use of my property, provide written acknowledgement that this was private property. I delivered this proposal in person to the HOA office, hoping that my willingness to compromise would be appreciated. The office administrator, a nervous-looking woman named Betty, promised to pass it directly to Victoria. "Just don't expect a quick response," she warned. "Mrs. Blackwood is very particular about how she handles these situations." While waiting for a response, I consulted with my insurance agent again. He was horrified when I showed him the traffic logs and accident near misses I'd documented. "This is a lawsuit waiting to happen," he warned. "Your current policy definitely won't cover this level of public use. We'd need to classify this as a commercial thoroughfare, which would increase your premiums significantly." A week passed with no official response from the HOA. However, I noticed an increase in traffic, almost as if people were deliberately using my road more frequently. The security cameras captured several instances of residents stopping to take pictures of my property and my private property signs. One evening, I even overheard two women walking their dogs discussing how the new owner was trying to make trouble and how Victoria would handle it like she always does. Finally, after 10 days, I received an official response from the HOA board. The letter, bearing Victoria's signature, was a study in passive-aggressive intimidation. It referenced community traditions, established patterns of use, and historical agreements, while completely ignoring the legal and liability issues I'd raised. The kicker was the final paragraph. "Given the long-standing nature of this access route and its vital importance to our community's transportation infrastructure, the board feels that any disruption to current usage patterns would be detrimental to community harmony. We strongly encourage you to reconsider your position and withdraw your unreasonable demands. The board is prepared to take all necessary steps to protect the community's interests in this matter." It was clear that my attempts at a reasonable resolution were getting nowhere. The HOA, under Victoria's leadership, had no intention of acknowledging my property rights or addressing my legitimate concerns. As I sat in my home office that evening, watching yet another stream of unauthorized vehicles passing by my window, I realized that stronger measures would be necessary. The time for polite negotiations was over. I needed to take definitive action to protect my property rights. The breaking point came on a quiet Saturday morning in late April. I was enjoying my morning coffee on the front porch, something I rarely got to do peacefully anymore due to the constant traffic, when I witnessed an incident that would change everything. A large white Mercedes SUV, which I recognized as belonging to Victoria Blackwood herself, came speeding down my private road well above a safe speed. As she approached the narrow curve near my house, another vehicle, a delivery truck making a legitimate delivery to my home, was coming from the opposite direction. Rather than wait or back up, Victoria attempted to squeeze past by driving onto my meticulously maintained lawn. The recent rains had left the ground soft, and her SUV's tires dug deep trenches into my yard, completely destroying a decorative flower bed I'd just installed the previous weekend at a cost of nearly $2,000. But what happened next was even more infuriating. Instead of stopping to acknowledge the damage, Victoria actually had the audacity to roll down her window and shout at the delivery driver for being in her way. The poor driver, clearly confused, tried to explain he was making a legitimate delivery, to which Victoria responded, "This is a community access road, and I have priority access. Next time, schedule your deliveries during off-peak hours." I grabbed my phone and started recording as Victoria's SUV tracked mud and mulch all across my paved driveway, leaving a trail of destruction in her wake. The damage wasn't just cosmetic. Her vehicle had also crushed one of the irrigation heads for my newly installed sprinkler system, causing water to spray uncontrollably across the driveway. The delivery driver, a man named Miguel, was kind enough to provide me with his contact information as a witness. "I've been delivering in this area for 5 years, he told me, shaking his head, "and that lady has always acted like she owns everything, but I've never seen her do something this brazen before." I spent the next hour documenting all the damage with my phone and the security cameras. The destruction was extensive, Deep tire ruts in the lawn, some nearly 8 inches deep, destroyed flower bed with crushed plants and displaced mulch, broken irrigation system, sprinkler head, mud and debris tracked across 50 feet of paved driveway, damaged decorative stone border along the flower bed, crushed landscape lighting fixtures. I immediately called my insurance agent, who sent out an adjuster that same afternoon. The adjuster's estimate for repairs came to $3,175, not including the cost of the original landscaping work that had been destroyed. When I mentioned who had caused the damage, the adjuster's expression turned serious. "You need to document everything," he advised. "This kind of entitled behavior usually escalates before it gets better." Taking his advice, I compiled a comprehensive incident report including security camera footage from multiple angles, photographs of all damage with measurement markers, the delivery driver's written statement, the insurance adjuster's preliminary report, timestamps and weather conditions, a record of previous incidents and communications. That evening, I sent a formal demand letter to both Victoria personally and the HOA board, detailing the incident and requesting immediate compensation for the damages. I also included a notice that, due to this incident, I would be installing security gates at both ends of my private road within the next 30 days to prevent further unauthorized access and property damage. Less than an hour after sending the email, my phone started blowing up with messages from various HOA board members. Some expressed shock at Victoria's behavior, while others attempted to downplay the incident as a simple misunderstanding. One board member, speaking off the record, revealed that similar incidents had occurred before, but Victoria's influence had always managed to keep them quiet. The next morning, I received an email from Victoria herself. Instead of an apology or offer to pay for damages, it contained what could only be described as a threat. "Your attempt to extort money from me and threaten our community's access rights will be met with appropriate legal response. I suggest you withdraw your ridiculous demands immediately if you wish to maintain any semblance of peaceful coexistence in this neighborhood." This was the final straw. Her response not only showed a complete lack of remorse, but demonstrated a level of entitlement that was simply staggering. I realized that any further attempts at reasonable discussion would be futile. It was time to take decisive action to protect my property, regardless of the inevitable backlash from Victoria and her supporters. I immediately began researching security gate companies and legal requirements for restricting access to private roads. What I didn't know at the time was that Victoria was already mobilizing her own response, one that would lead to one of the most bizarre confrontations I've ever experienced. After Victoria's threatening email, I knew I needed to act quickly and decisively. I spent the entire Sunday researching and making calls to various security companies, property lawyers, and contractors. By Monday morning, I had a comprehensive plan in place to secure my property once and for all. First, I hired Sentinel Security Solutions, a well-respected local company specializing in gated access systems. Their representative, Mark Davidson, came out to assess the situation and was shocked by the volume of unauthorized traffic. "This is a major liability issue," he confirmed. "You're absolutely right to want to secure this immediately." The security plan we developed included 2 automated security gates with reinforced posts, high-definition camera systems with license plate recognition, motion-activated lighting, emergency access keypads for legitimate service vehicles, reflective, private property and no trespassing signage, impact-resistant bollards to prevent gate circumvention, a sophisticated intercom system for visitor management. The total cost was substantial, nearly $28,000. But given the potential liability and ongoing property damage, it felt like a Necessary investment. I signed the contract that afternoon, and Mark promised to expedite the installation process. Meanwhile, I took additional precautionary measures. I hired a professional surveyor to definitively mark my property boundaries and document them with new surveys. The surveyor, Jennifer Martinez, discovered something interesting. Several of the HOA's decorative plantings and one of their security cameras had actually been installed on my property without permission. I also engaged the services of William Chen, a property rights attorney specializing in HOA disputes. When I showed him my documentation and Victoria's threatening email, he immediately recognized the severity of the situation. "This is actually quite serious," he explained. "Their actions could constitute criminal trespass, and their attempt to claim prescriptive rights over your property won't hold up given the clear history of private ownership. To ensure everything was properly documented, I set up a comprehensive security system beyond just the gates. This included multiple 4K security cameras with night vision capability, a cloud-based recording system with 60-day storage, motion sensors covering all potential access points, cellular backup for all security systems, real-time alerts for any security breaches, regular security patrols during the installation period. I also took steps to protect myself legally. Following Attorney Chen's advice, I filed a formal police report documenting Victoria's property damage, submitted all documentation to my insurance company, registered my property boundaries with the county recorder's office, posted legally, required notices about the upcoming access restrictions, documented all communication with the HOA and Victoria, set up a separate email address specifically for HOA-related communications. The installation process began 3 days later. The security company worked efficiently, but it was clear that word had spread through the neighborhood. Throughout the day, cars would slow down to watch the installation, and several residents took photos. I noticed Victoria's Mercedes drive by at least 4 times, though she never stopped or attempted to speak with me. One interesting incident occurred during the installation. A local news van pulled up, and a reporter attempted to interview me about the community dispute. It became clear that someone, likely Victoria, had contacted them, trying to paint me as the villain who was destroying neighborhood harmony. I politely declined to comment, but noticed the reporter's interest peak when she saw the security camera footage of Victoria's destructive driving incident. By the end of the week, the security infrastructure was nearly complete. The gates were impressive. Solid, automated barriers with professional signage and clear warning notices. The security company added an extra touch I hadn't expected, a large, illuminated private property sign that was impossible to miss, especially at night. The final element of my security plan was particularly clever, suggested by Mark from the security company. We installed a specialized camera system that would photograph and log every license plate that attempted unauthorized entry, automatically generating incident reports that could be submitted to law enforcement if needed. As the security team was finishing up the installation, I couldn't help but notice an emergency HOA board meeting being held at Victoria's house across the way. Through my new security cameras, I could see animated discussions taking place on her back patio. Little did I know they were planning their own response to my security measures, one that would lead to an unprecedented confrontation and ultimately expose years of HOA mismanagement. The morning the gates were officially activated started quietly enough. I had sent out formal notices to all legitimate service providers, mail carriers, waste management, and emergency services, providing them with the necessary access codes. I was working from home that day, anticipating some reaction from the neighborhood, but nothing could have prepared me for what actually happened. At precisely 7:45 a.m., I received the first alert from my new security system. Victoria Blackwood's white Mercedes was stopped at the gate, and she was repeatedly pressing the intercom button. I decided to let her wait for a few minutes, watching through the security cameras as she became visibly agitated. Finally, I answered, through the intercom system. "Good morning, Mrs. Blackwood. How can I help you?" I kept my tone professionally neutral. "Open this gate immediately." Her voice was shrill with anger. "You have no right to block access to a community road. This is private property, Mrs. Blackwood, as you're well aware, especially after last weekend's incident, which you still haven't addressed. What happened next was captured perfectly by my new security cameras." Victoria actually got out of her car, designer handbag clutched in her manicured hands, and marched up to the intercom. Her face was so close to the camera that I could see her expensive makeup caking in the morning humidity. "Listen here, you absolute nobody," she hissed into the intercom. "Do you have any idea who my husband is? He's a senior partner at Blackwood, Ross and Mitchell. We can bury you in so much litigation you'll wish you'd never moved here." I remained calm, thankful for the physical barrier between us. "Mrs. Blackwood, all of our interactions are being recorded, including your threats. I suggest you use the main entrance to your community, as this is private property." A line of cars had begun forming behind her Mercedes. I could see several residents getting out of their vehicles, gathering around Victoria like a Greek chorus. She seemed energized by the audience, turning to face them with dramatic gestures. "Look at what we have to deal with," she announced to her impromptu audience. "This person thinks they can just move in and disrupt our entire community. Well, I won't stand for it." To my astonishment, she then pulled out her phone and actually dialed 911. I could hear her conversation clearly through my security system. "Yes, hello? This is Victoria Blackwood of Whispering Pines Estates. I need to report a serious situation. Someone has illegally blocked a community access road with gates and is holding up traffic." "No, you don't understand. I'm a board member and this is preventing children from getting to school." "Yes, I'll hold." While she was on hold with 911, one of her supporters, a man I recognized as Dr. Peterson from 3 houses down, approached the intercom. "Look," he said, trying to sound reasonable, "we all know Victoria can be intense, but surely we can work something out. This road has been crucial for many of us." Before I could respond, Victoria shouldered him aside. "Don't negotiate with them, James. This is illegal imprisonment. They're trapping us in our own community." The situation was becoming more bizarre by the minute. Some residents had begun taking videos with their phones, while others were calling what I assumed were their lawyers. One woman was actually trying to squeeze her Mini Cooper through a small gap between my property and the neighboring fence, until she realized it would scratch her paint job. Finally, 2 police cruisers arrived, lights flashing. Officer Rodriguez and Officer Thompson, the same officers who had responded to previous incidents, stepped out, already looking weary when they recognized Victoria. "Mrs. Blackwood," Officer Rodriguez said, "this is the 3rd time this month we've had to respond to one of your emergency calls. Please tell me what the emergency is." Victoria launched into a dramatic recounting of how I was imprisoning the community and endangering children by forcing them to use the main entrance. Officer Thompson, meanwhile, had walked over to examine my gate and signage. "Ma'am," he interrupted her tirade, "these gates are perfectly legal. We have the property, paperwork on file from last week's incident. This is private property, not a public road." The crowd of residents had grown to about 20 people now, all watching as Victoria's face turned an interesting shade of red. But, we've always used this road. There must be some law, some precedent." "The only laws being broken," Officer Rodriguez said firmly, "are the ones about misuse of emergency services and potentially trespassing if you don't all clear out of this private property." That's when Victoria made her fatal mistake. In a fit of rage, she actually swung, her designer handbag at the security camera cracking its protective dome. The sound of shattering plastic was clearly captured by the backup cameras, along with the collective gasp from the crowd. The moment Victoria's handbag connected with my security camera, everything changed. Officer Rodriguez immediately stepped forward, his demeanor shifting from patient to stern. "Mrs. Blackwood, step away from the equipment and put your hands where I can see them." Victoria seemed to suddenly realize the gravity of her actions. Her face drained of color as she clutched her damaged designer bag, a Hermes Birkin, I would later learn from the insurance claim, to her chest. I was just frustrated. That camera was invading my privacy." Officer Thompson, who had been quietly observing until now, spoke up. "Ma'am, you're on private property, and you just deliberately damaged security equipment. That's criminal vandalism, regardless of your frustration level." Through my intact cameras, I could see the crowd of residents beginning to shift uncomfortably. Several people who had been vocally supporting Victoria moments earlier were now quietly retreating to their vehicles. Dr. Peterson, who had tried to mediate earlier, was shaking his head in disappointment. I decided to come outside at this point, maintaining a safe distance but wanting to be present for any official statements. As I approached, Officer Rodriguez was explaining to Victoria her rights, while Officer Thompson began taking statements from witnesses. "I want to press charges," I stated firmly, addressing both officers. "Not just for the vandalism, but for harassment, misuse of emergency services, and attempted trespassing. I have everything recorded from multiple angles." Victoria's response was immediate and theatrical. "This is ridiculous. Do you know how much this bag costs? It's probably worth more than your entire security system. If anything, you should be paying me for damages." Officer Rodriguez remained professionally stoic, though I caught a slight roll of his eyes. "Mrs. Blackwood, the value of your bag doesn't give you the right to use it as a weapon against someone else's property." What happened next would later become legendary in our community. Victoria, apparently deciding that doubling down was her best option, launched into a tirade that revealed far more than she probably intended. "This is just like when we dealt with that troublesome Johnson family on Maple Drive. We know how to handle people who don't understand their place in this community. Remember what happened to their property values after we started doing random inspections? Or what about the Patels and their unauthorized garden? We have ways of dealing with difficult residents." Officer Thompson had been taking notes, but his pen stopped moving as he looked up sharply at these declarations. "Mrs. Blackwood, are you admitting to orchestrating targeted harassment of other residents?" Several remaining spectators gasped. One elderly woman actually said, "Oh my," out loud, like something from a Victorian novel. The group of remaining residents quickly thinned out, leaving only a few die-hard supporters and several very interested police officers. I seized the moment to provide additional context. "Officers, I have documentation of similar threats made against me via email, including suggestions that the HOA board would use their authority to force compliance through questionable means." Officer Rodriguez nodded. "We're going to need copies of all that documentation. This situation has escalated beyond a simple property dispute." Victoria, seemingly realizing she had said too much, attempted to backtrack. "I simply meant that we have proper channels for dealing with community standards violations. Everything we do is completely legal." "Then you won't mind if we open an investigation into these practices?" Officer Thompson replied calmly. "Because what you just described sounds an awful lot like systematic harassment and discrimination." The next hour was a flurry of activity. Additional police units arrived to take statements and document the damage to my security equipment. Victoria was issued citations for vandalism and misuse of emergency services, though she wasn't arrested. However, the officers made it clear that a more extensive investigation would be following. As the police were wrapping up their work, I noticed several residents who had initially fled the scene returning, not to support Victoria, but to speak quietly with Officer Thompson. It seemed that Victoria's outburst had opened a floodgate of complaints that other residents had been too intimidated to raise before. By early afternoon, what had started as a simple gate confrontation had evolved into something much larger, a full-scale investigation into years of alleged HOA misconduct. Victoria left the scene in her Mercedes, but not before receiving a final warning from Officer Rodriguez about coming near my property again. The next morning, I received a call from Detective Sarah Martinez of the Community Relations Division. She requested a meeting to review all my documentation regarding the HOA situation. I spent the morning organizing everything into a comprehensive digital folder, including the property's complete history, which I had obtained during my initial purchase. Original deed documentation from 1952, all subsequent property transfers, current property surveys and boundary markers, utility easement documentation, zoning classifications and restrictions, historical aerial photographs showing the private road's existence predating the HOA chronological record of all interactions with the HOA. Email threads with Victoria and the board, security camera footage of multiple incidents, dated photographs of property damage, screenshots of the HOA newsletter referring to my private road voice recordings from the intercom system, witness, statements from delivery drivers and service providers, insurance adjuster reports, documentation of repair costs and estimates. Detective Martinez arrived promptly at 1 p.m., accompanied by Officer Rodriguez from the previous day's incident. I had set up my home office with multiple screens to display the security footage and digital documentation effectively. "This is impressively thorough," Detective Martinez commented as I walked her through the timeline. "Most people don't maintain such detailed records." I explained how my background in real estate law had taught me the importance of documentation. When we reached the footage from yesterday's incident, Detective Martinez leaned forward, particularly interested in Victoria's statements about the Johnson and Patel families. "Those weren't just empty threats," I explained, pulling up additional documentation. "I did some research after yesterday's incident. The Johnsons sold their house at a significant loss 3 years ago after receiving daily citations for minor violations. The Patels moved away last year after their garden, which had won community awards, was suddenly deemed non-compliant with HOA standards." Officer Rodriguez nodded grimly. "We've had complaints before, but nothing we could act on. People were always too afraid to press charges or provide evidence." I then shared something I hadn't shown anyone yet, an email thread I discovered through some careful digital sleuthing. Victoria had accidentally used her work email for some HOA communications, which were subject to public records requests due to her husband's law firm's municipal contracts. "Look at this exchange from 2 years ago," I pointed out. She explicitly discusses using HOA regulations to encourage certain elements to seek housing elsewhere. The language is carefully coded, but the intent is clear. Detective Martinez spent several hours reviewing everything, occasionally making phone calls to what I assumed were other department members. By late afternoon, she had filled 2 notebooks with notes and requested copies of all my digital files. "Mr. Mitchell," she said finally, "what started as a simple property dispute has unveiled something much more concerning. We're seeing patterns of systematic harassment, possible discrimination, and abuse of power. Would you be willing to serve as a primary witness if this goes further?" I agreed without hesitation. I have nothing to hide and everything documented. My only goal was to protect my property rights, but if my evidence can help others who've been bullied by this HOA, I'm all in. Before leaving, Detective Martinez shared some interesting information of her own. Apparently, after yesterday's incident, their department had received calls from 7 other current or former residents, with similar stories of harassment and selective enforcement. The problem with HOA disputes, she explained, is that they're usually civil matters, but when there's evidence of discrimination, harassment, or criminal behavior, like Victoria's vandalism yesterday, it becomes a law enforcement issue. Your documentation may have finally given us the evidence we need to address long-standing complaints about this HOA. As they were leaving, Officer Rodriguez turned back. One more thing, you might want to increase your security for a few days. People like Victoria don't respond well to being exposed. We'll have patrols in the area, but stay alert. I thanked them for their time and immediately took Officer Rodriguez's advice, activating additional security features I had installed but hadn't yet used. Within an hour of the officers leaving, I received an alert that someone was attempting to access my property from the rear boundary, exactly as Officer Rodriguez had predicted. The security alert came from my back property line, where my land met the HOA's communal green space. The cameras caught Victoria and 2 other HOA board members, Robert Bob Thompson and Linda Maxwell, attempting to place what looked like survey markers on my property. Through the high-quality audio on my security system, their conversation was crystal clear. If we can prove the property line is unclear, Victoria was saying, waving what appeared to be some kind of document, we can file an injunction based on boundary disputes. James says that could tie things up in court for months. Bob looked nervous, constantly glancing around. Victoria, after what happened this morning with the police, maybe we should step back and... Step back? Victoria's voice rose sharply. Do you have any idea what this could do to our property values? If people can't use this road, the north side properties will drop at least 15% in value. My house is on the north side, Bob. Linda, who was holding what appeared to be an old survey marker, chimed in. But the police said they're investigating now. If we get caught... We're not going to get caught, Victoria snapped. We're just conducting a routine property survey. There's nothing illegal about that. I had already contacted the police the moment I received the alert, and I could hear sirens in the distance. But what happened next was almost comical. My new sprinkler system, which I had programmed to activate if anyone crossed certain boundaries, suddenly sprung to life. Victoria's designer outfit, which looked expensive enough to pay for a month of my mortgage, was instantly soaked. She let out a shriek that probably could have been heard in the next county. Linda dropped the survey marker and slipped in the suddenly muddy grass, landing rather ungracefully. Only Bob managed to stay dry by leaping backward with surprising agility for a man his age. My Chanel suit. This is harassment, Victoria screamed, attempting to shield herself with the documents she was holding, which were now completely soaked and illegible. Through my security cameras, I watched as they attempted to flee the sprinklers, only to find themselves face to face with Officer Rodriguez and Officer Thompson, who had just arrived on the scene. The officers' body cameras would later provide additional angles of the spectacle, much to the amusement of the eventual investigation team. Mrs. Blackwood, Officer Rodriguez said, his voice carrying that special tone of tiredness reserved for repeat offenders. I believe we discussed staying away from this property less than 6 hours ago. Victoria, her perfectly coiffed hair now plastered to her face, attempted to salvage what dignity she could. We were conducting an official HOA property survey. We have every right to trespass and attempt to fraudulently place survey markers. Officer Thompson interrupted, picking up the dropped marker. Because that's what our body cams just recorded you discussing. Bob, showing more wisdom than his fellow board members, immediately raised his hands. I want to cooperate fully with any investigation. In fact, I have some emails on my phone that the detective might find interesting. Victoria's head whipped around so fast, I thought she might get whiplash. Robert Thompson, don't you dare! I know about your unauthorized pool. House extension. Linda, still sitting in the mud, burst into tears. I never wanted to be part of this. Victoria said we had to protect property values, but it's gone too far. She's been falsifying board meeting minutes for years. The scene devolved into a three-way argument, with each board member apparently trying to be the first to turn on the others. Officer Rodriguez finally had to whistle sharply to get their attention. "All right, that's enough," he announced. "Everyone's getting citations for criminal trespassing, and based on what we just witnessed, we'll be adding attempted fraud to the investigation." As they were all being escorted off my property, Victoria turned back for one final threat. "This isn't over. My husband's law firm will probably be very interested in avoiding any association with this situation," I called out through my security system speaker, "especially given that I've sent copies of all my evidence to the State Bar Association." The look on Victoria's face at that moment was priceless, a mix of rage, fear, and the dawning realization that her carefully constructed power structure was crumbling around her. As she was escorted to the police car, I could see neighbors gathering at the edge of my property, many openly filming with their phones. The following day, I received a call from the police department requesting my presence at the station. When I arrived, I found myself in a conference room with Detective Martinez, a representative from the district attorney's office named Michael Chen, and surprisingly, a federal investigator from the Housing and Urban Development HUD office. "Mr. Mitchell," Detective Martinez began, "what started as a simple property dispute has uncovered something much bigger. After yesterday's incidents and the evidence you provided, we've been able to connect several dots that have been concerning us for years." Mr. Chen opened a thick folder and spread out various documents. "We've had multiple complaints about this HOA over the years, but they were always careful to keep everything just below the threshold for criminal charges. However, your documentation, combined with what we obtained from Mr. Thompson and Mrs. Maxwell last night, changes everything." The HUD investigator, who introduced herself as Agent Sarah Reynolds, pulled out her own set of files. "We've been monitoring this HOA for potential Fair Housing Act violations, but could never build a strong enough case. The evidence you've collected, especially Victoria's emails and the security footage from yesterday, provides the proof we needed." They proceeded to lay out what they had uncovered in just 24 hours, multiple instances of selective enforcement of HOA rules based on discriminatory factors, falsified board meeting minutes and financial records, evidence of kickbacks from preferred contractors, unauthorized use of HOA funds for personal expenses, deliberate harassment of undesirable residents, manipulation of property values through targeted enforcement, false claims about Victoria's husband's legal authority. The attempted survey. "Marker placement yesterday was the final straw," Detective Martinez explained. "It's one thing to abuse HOA authority, but attempting to fraudulently alter property boundaries crosses into criminal territory." Mr. Chen nodded gravely. "We're preparing to file multiple charges, including criminal trespassing, attempted fraud, vandalism, misuse of emergency services, conspiracy to commit property fraud, criminal harassment, false documentation agent." Reynolds added, "Additionally, HUD will be launching a full investigation into potential Fair Housing Act violations. The patterns we've seen suggest systematic discrimination in HOA enforcement." They then presented me with a thick stack of documents. "We need your formal statements and permission to use your evidence in the upcoming cases." Detective Martinez explained, "Your security system footage will be particularly crucial. As I signed the necessary papers, Mr. Chen shared some interesting developments. Mr. Thompson has agreed to cooperate fully in exchange for immunity. He's already provided us with years of internal emails and documentation. Mrs. Maxwell is also negotiating a cooperation agreement." And Victoria? I asked, curious about the main instigator. Detective Martinez couldn't suppress a slight smile. She's not taking it well. After being released last night, she attempted to call an emergency HOA board meeting to vote on retaliatory measures against you. Unfortunately for her, we had already served the HOA with orders preventing any official actions without court approval. We expect her husband's law firm will distance themselves quickly, Mr. Chen added. They're already facing scrutiny from the State Bar Association over her misuse of their legal letterhead to make threats. The meeting concluded with them providing me with emergency contact numbers and additional security recommendations. While we don't anticipate any further incidents, people like Victoria can become desperate when their power structures collapse, Agent Reynolds warned. As I left the police station, I received a notification on my phone, a news alert from the local paper. Federal investigation launched into prestigious HOA, allegations of discrimination and fraud. Now, the story was already spreading, and my security cameras showed news vans gathering at the entrance to Whispering Pines. Later that same afternoon, my phone began buzzing incessantly with notifications. The remaining HOA board members had called an emergency meeting, but this time it wasn't at Victoria's house. Instead, they had rented a conference room at the local community center, and every homeowner in Whispering Pines had been notified. I received an official invitation as an affected party, though technically I wasn't an HOA member. Through my attorney's advice, I decided to attend, documenting everything with a small legal recording device. The scene at the community center was chaos. Over 100 residents packed the room, with more streaming in constantly. The atmosphere was tense, with clear divisions among the crowd. Some residents were huddled in small groups, whispering frantically, while others sat alone, arms crossed, glaring at the board members' empty seats. At precisely 7 p.m., the remaining board members filed in. Victoria was notably absent, but her presence loomed over the proceedings like a storm cloud. The interim board president, David Richardson, a silver-haired man who had previously been the treasurer, called the meeting to order. Given the events of the past 48 hours, he began, his voice shaking slightly, we feel it's necessary to address several serious issues that have come to light. What followed was 2 hours of revelations that left the room in shock. A forensic audit had uncovered years of financial irregularities. Multiple homeowners came forward with stories of harassment and selective enforcement. The board's legal counsel announced their immediate resignation. Several contractors admitted to inflated invoices under Victoria's direction. The property management company revealed they had been directed to lose certain complaints effective immediately. David announced, "We are implementing the following changes. All previous fines under review for potential discrimination. External audit of all financial records. New election process for entire board independent review of all HOA bylaws. Suspension of all non-essential HOA activities. Refund process for improperly assessed fines. New transparent complaint system." The room erupted in a mix of cheers and angry shouts. One elderly resident stood up, trembling with rage. "I lost my garden of 30 years because Victoria said it violated some rule she made up. Who's going to compensate me for that?" Another resident, a young mother I recognized from the school bus stop, added, "They fined us $500 for having a birthday party on a Sunday, claiming noise violations, but Victoria's parties went on until 2 a.m. The revelations kept coming. Each story seemed to inspire another resident to speak up, creating a cascade of complaints and accusations. The interim board members, to their credit, documented everything, promising a full investigation and restitution where appropriate. Then came the biggest bombshell of the evening. The HOA's insurance provider representative stepped forward with an announcement that sent murmurs through the crowd. Due to the ongoing criminal investigation and evidence of systematic misconduct, we are cancelling the HOA's liability coverage effective immediately. Until new leadership and proper controls are in place, we cannot maintain coverage of this property. David Richardson looked like he had aged 10 years in 2 hours. Without insurance coverage, we legally cannot operate as an HOA. We will need to suspend all operations except essential safety and maintenance functions until this situation is resolved. A young lawyer in the crowd stood up. I move that we immediately vote to remove the entire current board and establish an interim committee of homeowners to work with the investigators. The motion passed almost unanimously. As the meeting concluded, I noticed something remarkable. Residents who had been practically enemies under Victoria's regime were now talking, sharing stories, and even making plans to help each other repair the damage done by years of selective enforcement. On my way out, several residents approached me to apologize for their previous behavior regarding my private road. One even offered to help pay for the damaged security camera, saying, "We were all so afraid of Victoria's retaliation that we forgot how to be good neighbors." As I drove home that evening, I noticed something had changed in the neighborhood. The tension that had been palpable for weeks had been replaced by something else, a sense of community rebuilding itself from the ground up. The morning after the community center meeting, the true impact of Victoria's downfall began to materialize. My security cameras captured a steady stream of moving trucks entering Whispering Pines, not for new residents moving in, but for Victoria and her closest allies moving out, through neighborhood gossip, which now flowed freely without fear of retribution. I learned that Victoria's husband's law firm had placed him on indefinite administrative leave pending an investigation into his role in the HOA's legal threats. They had listed their massive colonial-style house for sale at a significantly reduced price, hoping for a quick sale before the property values potentially dropped further. Around 10 a.m., I received an unexpected visitor at my gate. It was Linda Maxwell, the former board member who had been caught with Victoria trying to plant fake survey markers. She looked different now. Gone was the designer outfit, and perfectly styled hair, replaced by simple jeans and a ponytail. Through the intercom, she asked if we could talk. After yesterday's revelations, I felt safe enough to allow her onto my property, though I kept my security system recording everything. "I want to apologize," she began, sitting on my porch with a cup of coffee I'd offered. "I got caught up in Victoria's world. The power, the prestige, the feeling of being part of the elite group. I never stopped to think about the people we were hurting." Linda then shared some revealing insights into Victoria's operation. She had maintained detailed files on every resident, looking for potential leverage board positions were given only to those who proved their loyalty to her. Contractors were required to provide personal services to board members at reduced rates. She had a network of informants who reported on their neighbors' activities. Fines were strategically used to either force compliance or drive out undesirable residents. The scariest part, Linda confessed, was how normal it all seemed after a while. Victoria had a way of making you believe that what we were doing was necessary for community standards. As we talked, my security system alerted me to activity at Victoria's house. Through the cameras, we could see her supervising movers while simultaneously arguing on her phone. Even from this distance, her agitation was evident. Linda watched the scene with a mix of pity and relief. She's been calling everyone she knows, trying to rally support, but no one's willing to risk getting caught up in the investigation. The country club even revoked her membership yesterday. The personal consequences continued to cascade throughout the day. By afternoon, news broke that Victoria's husband had resigned from his law firm to spend time with family. 3 other board members had listed their homes for sale. The HOA's preferred landscaping company had filed for bankruptcy. After losing their contracts, several residents had initiated civil lawsuits against Victoria personally. The local garden club had voted to restore Mrs. Patel's award-winning garden status. The Johnson family was considering moving back now that Victoria was gone. Around 4 p.m., I received another alert from my cameras. Victoria was making one last drive past my property. She stopped briefly at the gate, and for a moment I thought she might try something dramatic. Instead, she simply stared at the camera for a long moment before driving away. The security footage captured what looked like tears on her face. Later, that evening, Linda shared the most shocking revelation yet. Victoria wasn't even supposed to be on the HOA board. She forged documents about her property ownership status years ago. She actually rents her house from a corporate owner. Everything about her lifestyle was a carefully constructed facade. As news of Victoria's deception spread through the neighborhood, the remaining threads of her influence unraveled completely. Former supporters now openly shared stories of how she had manipulated and threatened them. Each revelation seemed to empower more residents to come forward with their own experiences. The day ended with a final piece of news. Victoria and her husband had reportedly left for an extended vacation at her sister's house in Florida, leaving their moving company to finish packing up their house. The mighty had fallen, and the neighborhood would never be the same. The day after Victoria's departure, my lawyer contacted me about presenting my evidence in both the criminal investigation and the multiple civil cases that were now being filed. I spent the morning organizing my extensive documentation into several categories: security camera footage, the initial confrontation at the gate, Victoria's vandalism of my security equipment, the attempted survey marker placement, multiple instances of trespassing, the final drive-by before she left. What made this footage particularly valuable was its crystal-clear quality and the fact that my security system automatically logged and time-stamped everything. Each clip included metadata that could verify its authenticity, making it virtually impossible to dispute in court. One particular piece of footage proved especially damaging. During the sprinkler incident, Victoria had dropped her handbag, spilling its contents. Among them was a notebook that contained what appeared to be a hit list of residents she planned to target for violations. The police had retrieved this evidence, and copies of those pages now supplemented my video documentation. Email and communication records, all threats and demands from Victoria, HOA board correspondence, witness statements from delivery drivers, communications with law enforcement, records of previous complaints, screenshots of HOA newsletters mentioning my private road financial documentation, property damage estimates, security system installation costs, repair bills for vandalism, professional survey costs, legal consultation fees, insurance claim records. The most damning evidence came from my backup audio recording system. While Victoria had damaged one camera, she hadn't realized that separate audio recording devices had captured every word of her threats and admissions. The quality was broadcast grade, thanks to my investment in high-end security equipment. Detective Martinez arranged a meeting with the district attorney's office to review all the evidence. The DA's team was particularly interested in one specific security clip that showed Victoria actually coaching other board members on how to selectively enforce rules. Remember, she could be heard saying clearly, "We never put the real reasons in writing. Always find a technical violation to cite. That way it looks legitimate on paper." My lawyer, watching this footage, actually whistled. This is textbook discrimination evidence. The way she's carefully coding her language while making her real intentions clear, it's exactly what investigators look for in these cases. The evidence wasn't just useful for the criminal investigation. Civil rights attorneys representing Other residents began contacting me through proper legal channels, requesting copies of specific footage that supported their clients' cases. One lawyer represented 6 families who had been forced out of the neighborhood through Victoria's targeted harassment. Perhaps the most unexpected use of my documentation came from an unlikely source, a graduate student at the state universities. Law school asked to use my case, with all names redacted, as a study in how technology can help combat HOA abuse. With my lawyer's approval, I provided sanitized versions of some of the evidence for educational purposes. The local news stations were particularly interested in the story, as it highlighted a growing issue with HOA overreach in the region. While I declined to appear on camera, I did allow them to use some of the less sensitive footage to illustrate their coverage. The sight of Victoria attacking my security camera with her designer handbag became something of a local meme. One piece of evidence proved particularly crucial: my time-lapse footage showing the gradual escalation of unauthorized use of my private road. This demonstrated that the HOA had actively encouraged the trespassing, rather than it being a case of individual residents making independent decisions. This helped establish the organized nature of the HOA's actions, upgrading the legal severity of their violations. The evidence also helped protect other residents who had been afraid to speak up. When confronted with clear video and audio proof of Victoria's methods, many felt empowered to share their own stories. Each new testimony reinforced the pattern of abuse that my documentation had first exposed. By week's end, my evidence had become the cornerstone of multiple legal proceedings. The criminal investigation into Victoria and other board members, civil rights lawsuits from former residents, insurance fraud investigations, state-level HOA regulatory reviews, federal housing discrimination cases. What started as a simple security system to protect my private road had evolved into a powerful tool for justice, giving voice to years of suppressed grievances and finally holding the powerful accountable. In the weeks following Victoria's departure, the neighborhood underwent a remarkable transformation. The interim HOA committee, led by residents who had previously been victimized by Victoria's regime, began implementing sweeping reforms. I was invited to attend their meetings as an advisory member, despite not being part of the HOA, due to my role in exposing the previous administration's misconduct. The first major change came in the form of a comprehensive property rights review. Every easement boundary and shared access point in the community was professionally surveyed and documented. My private road, which had been the catalyst for all this change, was officially acknowledged as private property in all HOA documentation, with clear signs and maps showing the correct community access routes. The new board took several concrete steps to prevent future abuses: implementation of a transparent digital system for violation reporting, required body cameras for all property, inspections, independent review board for all complaints, monthly public meetings with recorded minutes, professional property management company, oversight, regular external audits, term limits for board members, required ethics training for all HOA officials. One particularly satisfying moment came when the new board officially rescinded all of Victoria's special amendments to the HOA bylaws. These had included such ridiculous provisions as requiring board approval for any guest staying longer than 48 hours and mandating specific brands of lawn care products. The community's healing process was evident in small but significant ways. Mrs. Patel's garden was restored and became a community gathering spot. The Johnson family's old house was purchased by a young couple who received a warm welcome. Neighbors began organizing social events without fear of violation notices. Property Values actually increased due to the positive publicity about the reforms. Several local HOAs began adopting similar transparency measures. My security system, which had played such a crucial role in exposing the corruption, became something of a model for responsible property protection. The new HOA board even consulted with my security company to implement similar systems for their community areas, though with proper privacy protections and oversight. The resolution of my private road issue came with an unexpected twist. The new HOA board approached me with a unique proposal. They wanted to formally acknowledge my property rights and offer to purchase a limited-use easement for emergency vehicles only. The terms were fair: substantial monetary compensation, full liability coverage under their new insurance, professional maintenance of the road, security system integration with emergency services, clear signage and access control, annual review and renewal option. After consulting with my lawyer, I accepted the agreement. It felt like the right balance, maintaining my property rights while accommodating legitimate community safety needs. The agreement was properly documented, legally recorded, and transparently presented to all residents. The transformation of the community was perhaps best illustrated by what happened to my damaged security camera. The new board insisted on not just replacing it, but upgrading my entire security system at their expense, recognizing it as a valuable community asset that had helped restore integrity to the neighborhood. 1 year after the initial confrontation, the local paper did a follow-up story on the changes in Whispering Pines. They interviewed numerous residents, including Mr. Chen, who shared how his once strained relationship with his neighbors had been replaced by genuine friendships. The article highlighted our community as an example of how HOAs could be reformed to serve their intended purpose of community enhancement rather than control. Victoria's former house, which had sat on the market for months, was eventually purchased by a retired judge who specialized in property law. The irony wasn't lost on anyone, and his expertise proved valuable in helping the new board navigate the complex process of HOA reform. The final piece of resolution came in the form of a community gathering, a celebration of the neighborhood's transformation. It was held on the community green space, with my private road now properly marked with professional signage reading "Emergency Access Only, Private Property." The contrast between this peaceful celebration and the chaos of a year ago couldn't have been more striking. Hey everyone, I need to pause the story for a moment here, because what I'm about to share next is absolutely crucial, and I want to make sure you're all following along. If you've been enjoying this wild journey of HOA drama and justice being served, please take a second to hit that like button and subscribe to my channel. It really helps me continue bringing you these incredible true stories of standing up against entitled behavior and abuse of power. Also, a quick heads up. The comments section on my last HOA video exploded with similar stories, and I read every single one of them. It's amazing how many of you have dealt with similar situations, and I'm working on featuring some of your stories in future videos. So if you have your own HOA nightmare story, drop it in the comments below. Your experience might help someone else dealing with a similar situation. I've been getting a lot of questions about the security system I installed, so let me take a moment to explain why documentation was so crucial in this case. This isn't sponsored content. I just want to share what worked for me because I know many of you are dealing with similar situations. Key elements that made a difference: high-quality cameras with night vision, clear audio recording capabilities, motion-activated alerts, cloud storage backup, professional installation, multiple-angle coverage, time-stamped footage, weather-resistant equipment. Many of you have also asked about the legal aspects of this situation. While I can't give legal advice, I can share what I learned from my experience. The most important thing is documentation. Everything needs to be recorded, saved, and properly dated. This isn't just about cameras, it's about building a complete record. Keep all emails and written communications. Record dates and times of incidents. Take photographs of any damage. Save all official correspondence. Maintain a detailed timeline. Keep copies of all reports and estimates. Record all phone conversations, where legal. Save social media posts and community newsletters. Before we continue with what happened next in the story, I want to address something many of you have mentioned in the comments of my previous videos. A lot of you are currently living under HOAs and feeling powerless against similar abuse. Remember, knowledge is power. Understanding your rights and having proper documentation can make all the difference. I'm also excited to announce that I'm starting a new series specifically focused on property rights and dealing with difficult neighbors. Many of you have requested more detailed information about handling these situations, so I'll be covering topics like understanding property laws, dealing with boundary disputes, setting up security systems, handling harassment, working with law enforcement, documenting incidents effectively, understanding HOA regulations, protecting your property rights. Make sure you're subscribed and have notifications turned on so you don't miss any of these upcoming videos. I'll be sharing more detailed breakdowns of the legal process, the security systems I recommend, and expert interviews with lawyers who specialize in property rights and HOA disputes. And for those of you who've been asking about Victoria and what ultimately happened with the criminal charges, don't worry, we're getting to that part of the story next. And trust me, you won't want to miss it. The karma that's coming up in the next part of this story is absolutely incredible. Before we jump back in, I want to thank all of you for your amazing support. This channel has become more than just sharing stories. It's become a community of people helping each other stand up against injustice and abuse of power. Your comments, shares, and support make it possible for me to keep bringing you these important stories. Now, let's get back to what happened next, because believe it or not, the situation with Victoria and the HOA was about to take an even more dramatic turn. One of the most valuable aspects of this entire ordeal was the lessons learned, not just by me, but by the entire community and even neighboring HOAs. The situation had become a case study in how power can corrupt and how proper documentation and standing firm on your rights can bring about positive change. The first major lesson came from understanding the importance of knowing your property rights. I spent an entire weekend going through my experience with a local property rights attorney, breaking down key moments where knowledge of the law made a crucial difference. Property documentation essentials. Always obtain original deed records. Keep current surveys on file. Understand easement rights. Document property boundaries clearly. Know local zoning laws. Maintain records of all improvements. Keep copies of all permits. Understand right-of-way regulations. The second crucial lesson involved the power of proper security and documentation. My security system had done more than just protect my property. It had exposed years of systematic abuse. Here's what made the difference. Security best practices. Multiple camera angles for complete coverage. Professional-grade equipment. Backup power systems. Cloud storage for all footage. Clear warning signs. Regular system maintenance. Proper lighting. Emergency notification systems. Perhaps the most important lesson was about standing up to bullies while maintaining professionalism. Throughout the ordeal, I had kept my cool and let the evidence speak for itself. This approach proved far more effective than emotional confrontations. The local police department even requested to use my case as a training example for their community relations unit. Officer Rodriguez helped develop a presentation highlighting key points for handling property disputes, maintain detailed records, Stay calm during confrontations. Know when to involve authorities. Document everything in writing. Keep copies of all communications. Follow proper legal channels. Maintain professional behavior. Build a support network. The new HOA board took these lessons to heart, implementing their own set of learning points for future board members. HOA governance lessons. Transparent decision-making processes, regular financial audits, term limits for board members, professional property management, clear communication channels, fair enforcement of rules, regular community meetings, independent oversight. One particularly interesting development was how other HOAs in the area began reaching out to learn from our experience. The story had become a cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked power and the importance of proper governance. Local real estate agents even started using the reformed Whispering Pines as an example of positive HOA management. They created a checklist for potential homebuyers to evaluate HOA health, red flags to watch for, selective rule enforcement, lack of financial transparency, limited access to board meetings, excessive emergency meetings, unclear violation processes, personal vendettas, unreasonable fines, hidden fees. The experience also taught valuable lessons about community building. The new board focused on creating a positive environment rather than just enforcing rules. They implemented programs that brought neighbors together rather than driving them apart. These lessons weren't just theoretical, they had real-world impact. Several neighboring communities began reforming their HOA policies based on what they'd learned from our situation. The county even started requiring additional oversight for HOAs based on the issues exposed in our case. The final lesson, and perhaps the most powerful, was about the importance of standing together against injustice. Once people realized they weren't alone in their experiences with Victoria's regime, the wall of fear crumbled quickly. 3 months after Victoria's departure, the full extent of our success became clear through a series of validating events. The district attorney's office called a press conference to announce the results of their investigation into the HOA's activities under Victoria's leadership. Standing at the podium, DA Sarah Thompson detailed findings that exceeded even our expectations. Our investigation has uncovered systematic abuse of power, financial misconduct, and discriminatory practices that went on for years, she announced. Thanks to extensive documentation provided by concerned citizens and cooperation from former board members, we are filing multiple criminal charges. The charges included multiple counts of fraud, criminal harassment, falsification of official documents, misappropriation of HOA funds, criminal conspiracy, attempted property fraud, vandalism, and property damage. The success of the investigation was largely attributed to my security footage and meticulous record-keeping. Detective Martinez personally called to thank me, saying, "Your case broke open years of corruption. Without your evidence, we might never have gotten to the truth." The civil cases were equally successful. The class action lawsuit filed by former residents resulted in a substantial settlement, financial compensation for improper fines, reimbursement for forced property sales, damages for emotional distress, coverage of legal expenses, property value adjustments, restoration costs for damaged properties. But perhaps the most satisfying confirmation came from the state's HOA Oversight Committee. They used our case to create new regulations, mandatory financial audits, required video recording of all board meetings, limits on emergency powers, strict fine approval processes, regular election monitoring, required ethics training, independent complaint review processes. The FBI's white-collar crime unit even got involved, investigating the financial web Victoria had created. They discovered she had been running similar schemes in other states, using different names and false credentials. This led to federal charges being filed against her and several accomplices. Local news coverage highlighted the transformation of Whispering Pines. From HOA horror story to model community, how one resident's stand against corruption changed everything. The story gained national attention when a major news magazine featured it in an exposé about HOA abuse across the country. They used our security footage and documentation as examples of how technology can help combat corruption. Professional validation came from unexpected places. The State Bar Association used the case in their ethics training. Security companies referenced our setup in their training materials. Property management firms studied the case for red flags. Real estate agencies updated their HOA evaluation criteria. Insurance companies revised their HOA coverage policies. The reformed HOA received recognition from the National Community Association Institute for innovative governance practices, transparency initiatives, community engagement, fair enforcement, policies, financial management, conflict resolution procedures. Even Victoria's former allies began reaching out to cooperate with investigators. Linda Maxwell's testimony proved particularly valuable, leading to the recovery of misappropriated funds and the exposure of other corrupt practices. The success rippled beyond our community. Neighboring HOAs began reviewing their governance structures, updating their security systems, implementing transparency measures, revising their enforcement policies, creating appeals processes, establishing oversight committees. The final confirmation of our success came when property values in Whispering Pines actually increased, contrary to Victoria's dire predictions. Real estate agents reported increased interest in the community, citing its new reputation for fair governance and strong property rights protection. The real sense of closure came 6 months after the initial confrontation. The new HOA board organized a community gathering they called Restoration Day, a symbolic fresh start for Whispering Pines. The event was held in the community park, which had been renamed Unity Gardens, after the Patel's restored garden, became its centerpiece. What made this gathering particularly meaningful was seeing former residents who had been driven out by Victoria's regime returning to reconnect with their old neighbors. The Johnson family, who had been forced to sell their home at a loss 3 years ago, were there as honored guests. Mrs. Johnson could barely hold back tears as she shared their story. We thought we were alone in our struggle. Every day brought a new violation notice, a new fine, a new form of harassment. We didn't know others were going through the same thing. Standing here today, seeing the community come together like this, it helps heal those old wounds. The emotional impact was evident in small but significant moments throughout the day. Former adversaries sharing meals together, children playing freely without fear of violation notices, neighbors exchanging contact information, old friendships being renewed, new connections being formed, tears of joy and relief, laughter replacing tension. Mr. Patel, now heading the community's new garden committee, gave a moving speech about resilience and redemption. His wife's award-winning roses, once deemed non-compliant by Victoria, now bloomed freely along the community pathways. The most powerful moment came when Linda Maxwell, one of Victoria's former allies who had helped expose the corruption, stood up to address the gathering. Her voice shaking with emotion, she shared insights into how the toxic culture had affected everyone. We were all victims in different ways, she explained. Some were directly harassed, while others, like myself, lost our moral compass by participating in the abuse. The healing has to include everyone, those who were hurt and those who did the hurting, but have now recognized their mistakes. The emotional closure extended beyond just the residents. Officer Rodriguez and Detective Martinez attended the gathering, not in an official capacity but as friends of the community. They shared how this case had changed their perspective on HOA disputes and community policing. Personal vindication came in unexpected ways. Anonymous thank you notes left in mailboxes, small gifts of appreciation from neighbors, spontaneous hugs from former critics, invitations to community events, new friendships forming, offers of support and assistance, recognition from local officials. The security gate that had once been the focal point of conflict became a symbol of positive change. The new board had worked with me to create clear, fair access protocols for emergency vehicles, and the gate now bore a plaque reading, "Protected by cooperation, not control." Even my relationship with the community had transformed. Though I still wasn't technically part of the HOA, I'd become something of an unofficial advisor on security and property rights issues. Residents would wave as they passed by on the main road, no longer viewing my property as an obstacle, but as a catalyst for positive change. One elderly resident who had lived in Whispering Pines for over 3 decades summed it up perfectly. For years, we lived in fear of our own community. Now, for the first time, it feels like a real neighborhood again. We can breathe, we can live, we can be neighbors instead of adversaries. The emotional healing was perhaps best symbolized by what happened to Victoria's former house. The retired judge who purchased it transformed it from a symbol of oppression into a community legal resource center, offering free consultations to residents dealing with property rights issues. The long-term security measures implemented after this incident created a blueprint for protecting not just my property, but the entire community's rights and well-being. Working with security experts and the new HOA board, we developed a comprehensive system that would prevent any future attempts at abuse while maintaining proper access where needed. The new security infrastructure included advanced gate control systems with multiple authentication methods, high-definition cameras strategically placed at all key points, emergency vehicle override protocols, visitor management systems, real-time alert notifications, backup power systems, regular security audits, professional monitoring. The legal protections were equally robust. My attorney helped draft a series of documents that would prevent any future attempts to claim rights over my private road. Updated property deed with clear boundary specifications, recorded easement agreements for emergency access, detailed maintenance agreements, liability coverage documentation, access control protocols, insurance requirements, dispute resolution procedures, annual review provisions. The HOA implemented its own security measures to prevent future abuse of power, digital recording of all board meetings, transparent financial tracking systems, independent audit requirements, term limits for board members, multiple signature requirements for expenditures, public access to all records, regular security assessments, professional property management oversight, physical security improvements extended beyond just my property, community-wide camera systems, enhanced lighting in common areas, emergency response protocols, professional security patrols, access, control for amenities, visitor management systems, regular security training for staff, updated emergency procedures. The documentation system became particularly sophisticated, cloud-based storage of all records, regular backup procedures, multi-factor authentication, audit trail capabilities, time-stamped recordings, automated reporting systems, digital archiving protocols, secure access controls. Perhaps most importantly, we established clear procedures for handling future disputes, formal complaint processes, independent review board, mediation protocols, appeals procedures, documentation requirements, timeline requirements, communication protocols, resolution tracking. The technical aspects of security were matched by community engagement measures, regular security awareness meetings, neighborhood watch programs, emergency response training, community alert systems, regular safety audits, incident reporting procedures, security education programs, crisis management. Protocols, legal safeguards were put in place to prevent future abuse, updated HOA bylaws, clear enforcement guidelines, rights and responsibilities, documentation, dispute resolution procedures, appeals processes, legal review requirements, compliance, monitoring, regular policy updates. The financial security measures were equally comprehensive. Regular audits, multiple signature requirements, professional accounting oversight, transparent budgeting, reserve fund management, insurance coverage, reviews, financial reporting requirements, investment guidelines. These measures created a framework that would protect both individual and community interests well into the future, ensuring that no one could ever again abuse their position of power in the way Victoria had. The ripple effects of our HOA revolution extended far beyond Whispering Pines. Within a year, our story had become a catalyst for change in communities across the state and even nationwide. The impact manifested in ways we never could have anticipated when this all began. Local impact. The immediate area saw the most dramatic changes. Neighboring HOAs began proactively reforming their governance structures, not wanting to become the next Whispering Pines scandal. Our community became a sort of living laboratory for HOA reform, with regular visits from board members from other communities, local government officials, property rights attorneys, real estate developers, community organizers, security consultants, legal researchers, property managers, state, legislative changes. Our case caught the attention of state legislators, leading to new laws governing HOA operations, mandatory financial transparency requirements, stricter board member qualification standards, required video recording of all official meetings, enhanced protection for homeowner rights, limits on fine amounts and frequencies, required independent oversight, anti-discrimination provisions, clear appeals processes, media coverage. The story gained traction in various media outlets, national news features, documentary filmmakers, legal journals, real estate publications, security industry magazines, community newsletters, academic studies, social media discussions. Educational impact. Universities and professional organizations began using our case as a teaching tool. Law school property rights courses, real estate licensing programs, HOA management certification, security system design classes, community management training, ethics workshops, leadership seminars, professional development courses, industry changes. The security industry saw significant developments based on our experience. New integrated security solutions, enhanced surveillance systems, improved access control technology, better documentation systems, advanced monitoring capabilities, updated training protocols, innovative security features, specialized HOA security packages, legal precedents. The case established several important legal precedents: enhanced property rights protections, clear definitions of HOA authority limits, standards for evidence in HOA disputes, guidelines for security system evidence, privacy protection standards, discrimination prevention measures, due process requirements, appeal process standards, community organization. A nationwide network of HOA reform advocates emerged. Support groups for homeowners, legal assistance networks, property rights organizations, community action committees, educational resources, online forums, advisory councils, reform initiatives, professional development. The case influenced various professional fields: property management practices, security system design, legal education, real estate, training, community management, risk assessment, insurance policies, governance structures. Even Victoria's story had broader implications. Her case became a cautionary tale in ethics training programs, showing how power corruption can develop gradually and the importance of maintaining proper oversight and accountability. The reformed Whispering Pines became a model for other communities, demonstrating how proper governance, transparency, and respect for property rights could create a stronger, more harmonious neighborhood. Regular tours and workshops were organized to share our experiences and lessons learned. Perhaps most significantly, our story inspired others to stand up against similar abuses in their own communities. The documentation methods and security measures we implemented became a blueprint for protecting homeowner rights across the country. 1 year to the day after Victoria first confronted me at my gate, I received a package from the state's Attorney General's office. Inside was a formal letter thanking me for my role in exposing the systematic abuse that had led to sweeping reforms in HOA governance across the state. Along with it was a copy of the new Homeowner Protection Act, which had been directly inspired by our case. The final chapter of Victoria's story had also come to a close. The criminal trials had concluded with multiple guilty verdicts for fraud and harassment, substantial fines and restitution orders, community service requirements, professional disbarment for her husband, prohibition from serving on any HOA board, asset forfeitures, required ethics training, supervised probation. But the real conclusion wasn't about punishment, it was about transformation. Whispering Pines had become something entirely new, a thriving, inclusive community, regular neighborhood gatherings, collaborative decision-making, transparent governance, active resident participation, strong property rights protection, fair rule enforcement, genuine neighborly support. My private road, which had started all this, became a symbol of proper boundaries and respect for property rights. The emergency access arrangement worked perfectly, with clear protocols and professional maintenance. The gate that had once been a source of conflict now represented security and proper governance. The new HOA board had established themselves as leaders in community management, regular town hall meetings, open financial records, professional property management, clear communication channels, fair enforcement policies, resident involvement programs, transparent decision-making, strong ethical guidelines. Personal relationships had healed and grown. Former adversaries became friends. New residents felt welcomed. Old residents felt protected. Community spirit flourished. Trust was restored. Cooperation replaced conflict. Understanding grew. Respect prevailed. The security systems that had documented all the drama now served a different purpose: protecting community assets, ensuring proper access, maintaining safety, recording happy memories, supporting emergency services, preventing future conflicts, building trust, promoting transparency. Looking back, what started as a simple property dispute had evolved into something much more significant: a complete reformation of how communities can and should be governed. The lessons learned continue to influence HOA management across the country. As I sit here in my home office, watching through my security cameras as legitimate emergency vehicles occasionally use the properly marked access road, I can't help but reflect on how different things are now. The tensions and fear that once characterized this neighborhood have been replaced by something much more valuable: genuine community. And for those wondering about my security cameras, yes, they're still recording, but these days they capture much happier scenes: neighbors waving as they pass by on the main road, children playing safely in their yards, and a community that has learned the true meaning of respect for both property rights and each other. If there's one final lesson from this whole experience, it's this: standing up for what's right, even when it's difficult, can lead to changes far beyond what we initially imagine. Sometimes it takes one person saying enough to spark a revolution that benefits everyone. And with that, my friends, we've reached the end of this story. But remember, every ending is just a new beginning, and the positive changes we created here continue to ripple outward, inspiring others to stand up for their rights and build stronger, more respectful communities. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.